Hey guys, this video is sponsored by Steelseries, so make sure to stick around after the end to find out how you can get a discount on your next order. Well, here's something I never thought I'd be playing, and that's Techland's Dying Light 2, finally seeing the light of day in 2022, almost 2 years after its original intended release date. I actually did a video on the first game when it originally came out, and I'll be the first to admit that that wasn't the best review I've ever done, to the point that I've actually removed that video because it was really negative and it didn't really reflect how I felt about the game anymore.
Are you nuts? I'd kill myself.
And I'll be honest, going into Dying Light 2, I started to think the same thing might be happening because it really did take me a while to get into it. I'd say it was around 10 or so hours before I'd finally found my groove.
Welcome to paradise.
But all that did change eventually, and I'm actually kind of astounded at just how good this game's turned out, especially considering the troubled and long development cycle that it's had. I think it's kind of safe to say at this point that Dying Light 2 has really transcended just being a first-person zombie game. Now it's a game that just really tests your mental fortitude, forcing the player to make frequent narrative decisions which have really profound effects on how story events ultimately pan out. It's set about 15 years after the first game, and by now we're well and truly at a point where humanity has lost the fight against this virus, and we've really had to come to terms with living in a post-apocalyptic world. So it's much more The Walking Dead than Dawn of the Dead, let's just put it that way.
Got it, Aiden. Good work.
You're playing as a guy named Aiden, who's voiced by the closest they could get to someone who sounds like Troy Baker, without him actually being Troy Baker. Thankfully not a voice actor either, who sold out to NFTs.
At least until night falls.
Anyway, Aiden's a part of a group called the Pilgrims, morally ambiguous warriors that are kinda like guns for hire, and he's heading to a fictional city in Europe, somewhere, to find the whereabouts of his missing sister Mia.
Too bad.
Turns out when he was a kid, Aiden was involved in some kind of super top secret project that experimented on little kids or something, and after having a bunch of people playing around in his egg salad, he's now got all these repressed memories and a defective immune system. Yeah, don't we all? In gameplay terms, it means he's haunted by visions from the past, and he's also got to keep an eye on his immunity levels during nighttime, or else he'll start freaking out and turning into a zombie, which happens frequently. As Ja Rule would say, uh-oh, another episode.
Uh-oh, another episode.
After you get through this lengthy prologue, though, what happens next is entirely in the player's hands. And I gotta say that I think it's almost impossible to talk about the story fully, or even really spoil it, just because of the vast amount of routes the player can take. I wasn't kidding when I said that this thing has really transcended just being a zombie game, and honestly the amount of options you seem to have here when it comes to this is just insane. The devs have described this as a narrative sandbox, and I think that's really the best way to describe it. I mean, if I was to go off what I experienced during my story, the chances are it would be nothing like what Joey Joe Job Jr. Shabadoo experienced in his.
That's the worst name I ever heard.
It's kind of like one of those old choose your own adventure kind of books, only in this one, you don't end the story if you make a bad decision. Like throwing away your life savings into crypto, you're kind of forced to live with your own decisions here.
Oh, shit.
I mean, even the random little NPC conversations you're going to come across are likely to differ from player to player.
You're with someone?
Well, yeah.
Well, what can I say? I'm not at all surprised.
Enough already. This isn't going to happen.
I get it. Sorry.
Could this get more awkward?
I guess my point is that you can forget about bitching about spoilers in the video comments because, yeah, I know some of you love to do that. But just in case, I am going to wait until the end of the video to talk about anything story related, alright?
Haven't been here long, have you?
Right, so the real takeaway I got from playing through Dying Light 2 is that everything just kind of feels like a step up from the first game, which is, you know, exactly what you'd want from a sequel. And there's just so much stuff to talk about here that I don't think I could do it in a timely manner if my life depended on it, but I will try.
You will try.
I mean, for starters, visually the game does seem to look a bit better. Not really to the point that you'd say there's been a 7-year difference between both games, but there is still a definite upgrade here. The first game still kind of looks good even by today's standards, so it's not like they really needed to improve things all that much, but there's definitely a sense of there being a bigger scale and scope to the environments now, and the verticality of the second area of the city just can't be overstated enough. The map is apparently 4 times bigger than Haran, but navigating somehow felt faster. I mean, I think maybe due to the improved tools for traversal, and also the inclusion of a fast travel system. I mean, even if that doesn't get you right next to where you want to be, it sure beats getting there on foot. I've always kind of thought that Dying Light did a great job of just replicating what other games did and making it feel like its own. Like climbing windmills to unlock safe houses is more or less the same as climbing the radio towers in Far Cry. There's bandit camps which can be taken out with stealth or outright force, turning them over to whatever faction you're sided with, which again, sounds kind of familiar. And the lockpicking mechanic kind of uses the same interface we've seen in countless other games too, turning the lock and trying to find that sweet spot without accidentally snapping the pin like it's a toothpick. Even the binoculars are kinda similar to other open world games like State of Decay 2, letting you ping areas of interest and highlight enemies from a distance. I think the biggest difference between both the first and second game this time though is the night and day cycle. Mostly in the way that nighttime looks completely different and almost like not really like nighttime at all. Compared to Dying Light 1, where you often couldn't see jack shit if you're running around after the sun's gone down, here in Dying Light 2 you can actually see pretty easily. When you head inside buildings though, it's a bit of a different story, and some of these interior buildings are darker than a coal miner's asshole. The reason I think they've done this is because a lot of the missions and activities take place at nighttime now. Throughout the city are various buildings full of loot, but more importantly, inhibitors, which is like 150 or so different hidden collectibles which are used to upgrade your stamina and health points. Power up! And the thing is, you don't really want to go banging around inside these buildings at daytime because the bigger and badder zombies like the volatiles are going to be hanging around and getting up to no good. As they say, when the cat's away, the mice will play, so nighttime is when it's much more safe to go into these buildings and pluck out those juicy rewards within. Notice I said more safe though, because these still do serve up some of the more tense moments. There's still going to be lingering zombies sleeping inside these buildings, and trying to sneak past these guys and take them out without alerting the horde just makes for some really harrowing sequences. Plus inside these buildings you've got to keep a constant eye on Aiden's dwindling immune system. Yeah, I know, another game where you've got to fight back against a potentially life-threatening virus. Outside, you can still get into these intense chases with a seemingly never-ending onslaught of zombies, but it does feel a lot less threatening than running away from those volatiles in the first game. Looking over your shoulder and seeing one of those guys trying to eat your ass still ranks up there as some of the most intense chase sequences I think I've ever experienced. Outside of me trying to sneak out of your mum's bedroom on a Sunday morning. I still really like how that blue UV light looks when it's contrasted with the darkness of the night. The way that foliage and grass has now overgrown the city, covering rooftops and bushes and trees, I think also looks really cool. And it kind of emphasizes that passage of time since the world's gone to shit. And there's just so many little random encounters throughout the city to truly make it feel like a real and fleshed out place. Like coming across a lone bandit wailing on some poor unfortunate soul, seeing a survivor struggling with a zombie attack, or just bandits looting. It's all these little one-off chance encounters that you can intervene with if you really want to.
Night runner my ass!
You got knocked the fuck out!
Yeah, I gotta say too, the violence and the gore in this thing is still the stuff that boners are made of. I mean, it's so effortless that you almost forget that it's there sometimes, but when you really take the time to notice the finer details, you start to realize just how impressive it is. Things like chopping someone's head off in combat and the way they'll flail their arms for a couple of seconds before the rest of their body catches up. I mean, that kind of stuff is haunting but impressive at the same time.
Ouch town population, you bro!
However, this does all come with a whole lot of jank though, and there are some seriously glitchy moments in this game. Not Cyberpunk 2077 levels of glitch, but glitchy all the same.
Oof, this isn't the right department.
Come again.
Just like floaty movement and platforming controls, NPCs not appearing or stuck in walls, or just bad glitchy combat. At one point I had a mission where I had to sneak into some kind of water tower, and I died outside the building accidentally, but then when I respawned, it spawned me inside the building on top of the objective. So, thanks, I guess? There was a boss fight where I drop kicked someone into the wall, and I don't know, I guess it just kind of spazzed him out or something, because it made the fight end instantly. Overall though, I do think that is kind of part and parcel, I guess, for a game that's got such a huge scope, but also one that's been made by European developers. I mean, the term Eurojank exists for a reason. I know to some kind of people this thing is really endearing, and I think it is fine as long as it doesn't overtake the instances when the game works properly. Thankfully, I don't think that's a massive problem here, but I do think people who kind of pretend like this is smooth and flawless are being a little bit delusional.
Bullshit!
Now, it is kind of hard for me to comment all that much on the performance side of things, because I've got the kind of rig now that would be used to power up the secret lair of a Bond villain. But I gotta say that with my 3080 Ti, I had nothing but stable and smooth performance pretty much the entire time. I mean, aside from those aforementioned glitches, I didn't have any stuttering, there was no lagging or crashes to desktop, nothing like that, which is in stark contrast to the first game, which I can't even launch anymore. I guess my point is, look, if this thing ends up running like crap on your rig when it finally launches, well, then that sucks. But I can't really comment on bad performances or technical issues if I don't experience them.
You will try.
Now, moving on to the combat, I think people who played a lot of the first game are going to feel right at home here. Dying Light 2 has had a few new tricks added, it's just they're not exactly massive changes. Just really minor things which kinda should have been there from the beginning of the first game anyway. To be honest though, I've got to say that for like the first 10 or so hours here, didn't really like the combat all that much, and the reason for that is because all of the best moves again first need to be unlocked, and that's not really going to happen until you're a solid chunk into the game. I mean, even something as simple as a charged up heavy attack has to be unlocked first. This is part of why I think I didn't like that first game initially. I mean, you didn't even get the grappling hook until right up near the end of the story, and that thing was game changing. It changed the game. And again, Dying Light 2 has a similarly slow burn. You're going to really need to invest some serious time here unlocking all of these new abilities, and that goes for the parkour aspects too, which we'll get into soon enough. And I think it's important to mention this because once you start unlocking some of the better moves, the combat becomes immensely more fun. And it starts to really open up, turning you into post-apocalyptic Batman. I mean, if Batman was into chopping off limbs and stomping on heads. Now you're jumping into the ground and sending out a shockwave. You're drop kicking dudes off rooftops, throwing them to the ground like you're the ultimate warrior, or stomping on heads and turning them into goddamn paste. The best new inclusion though is that they've added in the option to block, but more importantly, parry attacks. And despite being such a simple addition, this alone just makes the combat so much better. Now look, I don't think I need to explain how a parry works, but all it really means is waiting until the last possible second when an enemy strikes to block, which throws them off balance, then setting them up for a counterattack. In Dying Light 2 though, it works a bit different because you can then use that dazed enemy like a bit of a human pommel horse, launching off their back and then drop kicking whoever's nearby, which really never does get old. You can also throw bricks or bottles to stun them, or just pick up a nearby spear and lodge it into their chest for good measure, and again, that never gets old. It's far more than just parrying all the time too. Enemies often do these charged up Kamehameha attacks, which you have to avoid entirely. Plus, even a scuffle between a couple of bad guys can turn into a gangbang if someone manages to call for reinforcements. There's a new armor system as well, which really lets you specialize your weapons and playstyle, whether it be focusing on using one or two-handed weapons or bonuses for combat or parkour skills. And I gotta say too, I really like how this affects how Aiden looks on the main menu. Some of these outfits are a bit weird though, and they kind of look like you're about to drop the fattest mumble rap album of 2022, but the freedom you have in buffing up your personal playstyle is a pretty cool inclusion. And let's also not forget the option to modify and customize your weapons too. Still think that's one of the most satisfying elements of the combat is whacking someone with your souped up machete or hammer, giving them like a jolt of electricity, a burst of fire, or a toxic attack. Didn't really take me all that long to fall back into old routines though. I already mentioned before they brought back the dropkick and the head stomp, but I mean they kinda had to. It's like making a Doom game without having the chainsaw or the BFG. And again, this is just such a broken combo. It's way too easy to run up to a couple of dudes and kick them off a rooftop for instance, or just grapple some poor asshole to the ground and then finish him off with a ground stomp. Is it cheesy? Yes. Is it fun? Fuck yes. I mean, unlocking that dropkick again was like coming across an oasis in the middle of the goddamn desert. And then the ground stomp on top of that was like the oasis just opened up its own whiskey bar. Well, how about sliding? That's a neat trick. Sliding into enemies, knocking them on their stomach, and then finishing them off with, you guessed it, the goddamn ground stomp. Once you've unlocked the full roster of moves here, the combat just kind of becomes trivial, even on the so-called hard mode. Yeah, hard mode, where resources are apparently incredibly strict and hard to come by, but yet I always had hundreds of resources in my inventory at pretty much all times. Now, they did find a few ways to fuck the whole thing up though, and I think by far the most annoying aspect of the combat are those enemies you've got to deal with who use a bow. Because while you're trying to fight all these guys at melee range, there's always some idiot that's hanging back and shooting at you off in the distance. It just kind of forces your hand and makes you have to focus on them first and foremost, and that's just annoying. And don't even get me started on those enemies who spit fire at you. Not in like a hip-hop sense, I mean they actually spit fire.
Because I spit hot fire.
These guys take a swig of like moonshine or jet fuel or something, then spit out a fireball, and I just think this is the dumbest thing in the entire game.
Damn.
Fighting the zombies is usually pretty straightforward. These guys are really just slowly moving punching bags, but the recently turned zombies called virals are so annoying that I actually started killing them as violently as possible to almost send a message to the rest of them. You know when you're driving in the rain and you see a big puddle, so you steer off a bit so you can drive through it? Well, these guys were my puddle, only I drove over their face this time with the bottom of my boot and the edge of my goddamn machete. This ain't like a Steven Seagal movie either, where these guys all wait for their turn to attack you. Nah son, these guys waste no time in piling on top of you all at once. They've also removed a lot of the ranged weapons like the rifles and pistols, but then they've left in this incredibly powerful crossbow that you can only get by siding with one of the main factions. And it is so easy to cheese through the combat with this weapon that I actually didn't use it on purpose. Throwable weapons like Molotovs and grenades are back, but they do so little damage initially that you may as well be throwing water balloons at people instead. And off the back of that, it really does kind of feel like Techland couldn't find that middle ground when it comes to the combat. I mean, you're either using like an item or an attack that is so ineffective that you'd be better off fighting in someone's face to try to kill them. Then on the other hand, you've got these moves and weapons that are so utterly overpowered and broken that it just removes any semblance of challenge whatsoever. Some of the new moves do seem kinda half-baked and not all that fleshed out either, like this one where you can tackle someone and then use them as like a human shield. One point I even tackled someone off the top of a goddamn building and it did no damage. Yeah, no damage. When at that point he really should have turned into a human omelette. Kinda reminded me of that one scene in Austin Powers.
Why won't you die?
There's also a basic stealth system here as well, which is mostly used when taking over bandit outposts or sneaking through those zombie infested buildings, but it really just boils down to scripted takedown animations and that's about it. I mean, you can't even pick up bodies and hide them. Finally, I did kind of feel like the UI in this thing is really horrible and kind of clunky to navigate. But like trying to swap through my healing items or swap through my throwable weapons was just really awful. And it requires lots of fiddling around in an inventory screen that's just a bit of an eyesore. Just kind of comes back to what I was saying before, how the whole thing is far from perfect. And it just kind of depends on whether or not you can derive enough fun from the gameplay to overlook all of this stuff. If there's one thing I really did like though, it's the free running. And I think this might be some of the best parkour mechanics in any first person game, maybe ever. Even if, again, all of the cool moves are hidden behind hours of playtime and locked abilities. They've made a pretty fundamental change to how this all works as well, so now instead of using stamina when running, now you can just run infinitely. Your stamina instead drains when you're pulling yourself up ledges, jumping and hanging on for dear life. And it now kind of adds a sense of urgency to some of these sequences, forcing you to really haul ass. Though it can be a little bit annoying early on though, because you've got about as much stamina as an arthritic grandmother, and you fall off things constantly. For movement options, there's new additions like poles you can vault across, you've got airbags. For movement options, there's new additions like poles you can vault across, there's airbags planted in the ground, you've got bars to swing from, there's ropes, and you can even wall run the few times the environment allows it. There's a construction tube thing you can slide through too, and the visual of using this thing kind of made me realise I spend way too much time on the internet. I think the weirdest addition though are these punching bag looking things you can spear tackle, which lets you land on the ground safely. And they're kind of weird because I think even in real life, like once that bag popped, I mean, you'd still kiss the asphalt with so much force that it'd turn your face into a pancake. The biggest game changer though is the paraglider. Yeah, you ever play Call of Duty Warzone and drop in with the boys? Yeah, same thing. Hold down the Z button and this thing pops out, letting you slow your descent and glide around like a majestic creature through the desolated streets of this dilapidated city. It then somehow folds itself back up with no cooldown and is instantly able to be used again. And it's actually a pretty damn good inclusion, because the second area of the city is a lot more vertical with these huge skyscrapers that are literally hundreds of meters tall. So simply being able to jump off the edge of a building and float down safely is a great feeling. And it just kind of means you don't have to worry too much about meticulously making your way back down from a high building or worry too much about falling over the edge. And I gotta say, man, there are some huge ass buildings in this game. I don't normally get too freaked out by platforming in video games because, you know, I'm not a bitch. But there were moments in this game that got my asshole puckered up so tight, it could have been used to turn a lump of coal into a diamond. I gotta be honest, I was audibly gasping during some of these jumping sequences. And combined with that insane draw distance of the engine, it kinda reminds you just how dangerous your surroundings are.
Fuck!
This place makes Cambodia look like Kansas, and if you lose it here, you're in a world of hurt. The only weird thing about the paraglider is that controlling it somehow burns through your stamina, which doesn't really make much sense to me. I mean, you're hanging from it. Does it really take that much energy to hang from something? Does become less of an issue when you upgrade it, because even the first upgrade dramatically improves it, but initially it feels kinda clunky, and losing control of this thing while you're in the air basically turns you into dead weight on a collision course with the pavement. Finally, right near the end of the story, you'll get a grappling hook, though if you're hoping for the same thing from the first game, well, then you're going to be disappointed. Because this thing's more just there to let you create your own makeshift rope to kind of Tarzan swing around. Doesn't actually pull you upwards with any kind of real momentum, which is a bit of a bummer. You use it during some pretty sphincter tightening platform sections though, sections which are kind of long, and I'm actually kind of impressed that Techland were ballsy enough to make them this challenging. But I just never found that much of a use for it outside of those few times you have to use it during key missions. My main issues with the platforming are some of the weird control choices. I mean, for instance, once you've unlocked the slide move, because you're always sprinting, if you press the C button at any time, you're gonna slide. Even if you're crouch walking and press the C button, yeah, you'll slide. And it might not sound like that much of an issue, but believe me, you end up unintentionally sliding way more than you mean to. I've also had plenty of times when Aiden just won't even grab onto what I want him to grab onto, or even the simple act of climbing up something just seems impossible. And that kind of brings me on to the final point I wanted to talk about, which is the pacing of the story itself. Yeah, the story. Remember how I told you we'd get to that last?
I lied.
Now, Techland made some pretty bold claims about this game prior to its release, saying it'd take you upwards of 500 hours to completely 100% it, which already doesn't make much sense if you think about it, because you will literally cut off entire quest chains by the decisions you make in your playthrough. But even though that sounds like a gross overestimation, one thing is still true. This is a huge-ass game. The story in this thing is just ridiculous, and I don't really mean that in a bad way. I mean more the amount of options and routes the player can take when it comes to their narrative decisions.
Let's just say it wasn't love at first sight.
Although paths are going to converge, I think a lot of people are going to have very different experiences when they play through this. I was speaking to a mate of mine who was playing through this at the same time as me, and we soon realised we were almost playing entirely different games, and the characters I'd interacted with and the scenes I'd experienced were nothing like what he'd played.
I do it all the time, no biggie.
This is a good thing. I mean, it gives the game a whole lot of replayability, but the question is, are you really going to replay like a 25-hour long story just to see how all these paths branch out? Because I'm sure not.
Help me, and I'll help you.
Aiden's almost like the man with no name in this, strolling into this town that's in the middle of this giant conflict with two main groups on each side that he can choose to bat for.
Who are you?
The two main factions are the survivors and the peacekeepers, and both are groups that are just trying to make ends meet, each with their own goals and agendas, but they're essentially the closest thing we get to the good guys.
People of the Bazaar aren't making this easy. They're proud and loyal. They refuse to turn anyone in.
They do a lot of bad shit here and there, but Po body's nerfed, and both of these factions are a good example of that. Along with that, Aiden's also trying to find the whereabouts of his sister, and also ends up working with another survivor named Lawan, voiced by Rosario Dawson.
I'm going back to looking for them. You shouldn't stay here either.
Who you might remember from Sin City, Clerks, The Mandalorian, and when she also appeared in every single Marvel TV show that's ever existed.
What?
So, not only do you need to worry about your interactions with her, I mean, she's got her own motives and reasons for being here too, but also finding your sister, and then which faction's gonna help you get there. Early on in the game, you make a pretty clear-cut decision as to who that's going to be, and that right away essentially creates two separate possible timelines. I mean, it's like Dying Light's multiverse of madness. I ended up going with the Peacekeepers, only because out of both factions, these guys didn't try to kill me when they first met me. They instead chose to interrogate me in a dimly lit room, and look, I'll take that over being hung by the neck any day of the goddamn week. From a gameplay side of things, siding with either faction gives you upgrades throughout the city as well. Across the city, you take over these water and power stations, then giving control to either group, which then unlocks its own rewards. Savvy?
Got the gist.
So going with the Peacekeepers gives you an exploding car trap. There's an electric trap and a random turret you can shoot zombies with. Even better than that though is that semi-automatic crossbow, which like I said is just such a broken weapon that it really does feel like cheating. But even still, despite who you choose, you're going to keep learning new things about these key players. People you might have thought were on the straight and narrow now end up having a darker path and these ulterior motives. And it might turn out that Aiden is being manipulated and not really being told all the facts.
He will be devastated.
So now you've got to reassess whether or not you still even want to work with them, and this kind of thing is happening constantly. I mean, there's just so many options you can take here, it's just mind-blowing. My mind was blown. It even all carries across to the side missions too. There's a side mission early on where there's a guy who's been accused of selling contaminated water, and when you confront the person he's buying it from and find out the reasons that it's contaminated, you can either let the whole thing slide or choose to turn the guy in, where he'll outright try to kill you.
Just be honest and tell your story to the bazaar.
No. No, I don't think I will.
You serious?
Same thing later on, there's like a mission involving a gold-digging girlfriend who's accused of going all Black Widow mode and killing all her ex-boyfriends.
It's nothing. Just a disagreement. A loud one, I guess.
And it's easy enough to point the finger at her and say she's guilty, but take the time to hear her side of the story and it expands the mission entirely. And again, these are just for random side missions. I mean, damn.
And my job here is done.
The issue with the campaign, though, ain't really the amount of options that it gives you, it's really just how long the main story goes on for.
Nah, I'm good.
It just kind of felt like every time things might be coming to a head, it somehow finds another way to keep on going. And there's only so many shocking revelations and plot twists the player can take before the whole thing just starts to lose its impact. You have to sit through so many big moments in this campaign that you almost kind of start to lose track of who you're even sided with anymore. The final epilogue sequence is in like the point of no return before finishing the main story, is like this 2-hour-long mission which is honestly about 90 minutes longer than it needed to be. And it throws so much information at you and expects so much back that when I finally finished the game, I actually had to take a break from my computer for like the rest of the day. It felt like I'd been running my brain on low battery mode for 20-something hours and I just had to get off there and recharge. And I think the biggest blunder to all of this is that you can't manually save either. You can't make manual save slots to see how each plot point might have played out, and this might be the dumbest thing of all, because once you make a decision, that autosave kicks in and then you're stuck with it. This might have been done by design to force the player to live with their decisions and see how the whole thing played out, but sometimes you might just misunderstand what you're actually being asked to do. So going back in and being able to change your decision when context is brought back would have been an absolute godsend, but you can't, you're stuck with it. And if you regret the choice you made, well, then I'm sorry, but you're just kinda fucked.
The time for talking is over. We're gonna fuck this place up.
And this might have been fine for like an 8 to 10 hour long campaign you can play through multiple times to see how the whole thing plays out, but for like a 25 hour long campaign, I do want to say though that I don't think this is an objectively bad thing, and look, if you're paying good money for something, you expect to get value out of it, and that's fine. I just think the main story should wrap itself up in a reasonable amount of time, and it just kind of made me feel that once I finally got to that free roam mode, I kind of had no energy left at the end to go off and start doing all of the side stuff. Even after beating that story around like the 30-hour mark or so, I still had a metric shit ton of stuff to do. I had camps to discover, side missions to complete, military drops to scavenge, and more needless stuff to find and loot. I mean, there is a huge game in here to begin with. I just don't think it needed to be bogged down so much with what I feel is a needlessly long story.
He ain't lying.
And you know what? I feel like even after saying over 6,000 words here to try to describe my experiences with this thing, I feel like I'm really only scratching the surface. Ultimately, look, there's a lot of stuff in Dying Light 2 which has been done before. It really doesn't tread all that much new ground when it comes to things like the combat and the parkour, sure. But the way this thing handles its story, despite how long it often feels, I have to say, it just fucking stuns me. And I think that has to be one of its biggest strengths. It really has to be some kind of monumental achievement for just how varying this story can be. Again too, at a time when we're often getting games that are about 70% finished, with the remaining 30% coming in the months to follow, it's kinda nice, man, to get a game that can be played from beginning to end without any serious hiccups. I know it seems weird to praise a game for being released in a finished state, but in 2022, that's becoming something of a rarity. Yeah, I definitely had issues with certain things, and at times I wanted to rage quit and never go back, but ultimately, I did. And I think that's the hallmark of a good game. Even on those off times when you get the shits at something and you stop playing, all you want to do is get back in there and see the whole thing through to its end. And in a world where you have total control over how that all pans out, well, it makes for a pretty damn memorable experience. When you add in drop kicking and head stomping, well, then it's even harder to find fault in it. Right, so if you're still watching, well, thanks for sticking around, and let me give a final shout out to my sponsor, Steelseries. Steelseries makes some of the best gaming peripherals, from headsets, keyboards, mice, and gaming pads, all synced together with a handy program that lets you modify the hell out of them. I'm a bit of a stickler for high quality mouses and keyboards, and whether you're playing a game that's 8 months old or 8 years old, it makes a huge difference in how well something handles. I would never recommend something that I don't use myself, and I'm pretty stoked to be able to offer a discount to people looking at buying some new gear. So just make sure to use that Chad promo code GMAN at checkout to get 12% off your next order. And as always, thanks for watching.